A privilege to join with you, and greetings from me and the church family in Selston also. I'd like to reflect on those words from Genesis in just a moment, but before that, a New Testament reading as well. And I'm going to read a familiar story from Luke 15 and from verse 11. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "Many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring in his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' My son, the father said, 'You are always with me, and everything I have is yours.' But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And we give thanks to God for this reading as well, and pray He'd be with us as we reflect on it now. Shall we pray? Well, Lord, we love you. We love you and we long to hear from you. Speak to us now, we pray. May this be a new word to us. May it meet us at the point of our needs. And may anything that is just a human thought go quickly from our minds. But may what is of you, what you want us to hold on to, stay with us. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, as I said, thanks again for the privilege of being here, and to Steph for leading. It's been a particular privilege to see Alan and Steph again, and to work with you, and particularly Steph, for you to open up a lot of the things which I think are going to be of a piece with what we're going to think about now. Years ago, when I was doing my A-levels, I had to study the work of Philip Larkin, English poet. Some of us might know of him. And to be honest, I don't remember much of what he wrote. But I do have a vivid recollection of the day I first came across a poem called "This Be the Verse." And I can remember the poem for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it contained a very rude word. And so I'm going to change the words of the poem when I read it to you, because I'm in church. But I also remember it because it seemed to convey some whole truths in a very witty way. And so here's the first verse. Here's how it goes. Thanks, son. They mess you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra, just for you. And so it goes on. Now my guess is there are quite a few of us who will have heard that before, and you will nod your head, even if you haven't heard it before, because we kind of know the truth of it. We know it from our dealings with our own parents, and we know it also from how we maybe relate to our children if we've had them. There are some occasions, I'm sure we've all been there, there are some occasions when I find myself doing something or saying something in some way or another, and it just feels as if I'm becoming my dad. Have you ever had that? I just stood there and thinking, where did that come from? Well, I know where it came from, because that's just the sort of thing he would have done or he would have said. I'm sure we will have had similar experiences. I look at times when the kids, R2 will behave in certain ways and do certain things, and I go to my wife, and I'm a bit exasperated, and she smiles and she says, well, I think I know where they came from, you know? And we see this stuff in ourselves, and we see it in other people. And you know, again, I'm sure we've all been in a place of meeting someone or getting to know them, and there's some aspect of their behaviour that we might find challenging or infuriating, and then we meet their parents, and it all just makes sense, you know? It all just makes sense. Once that's happened, we might even think, well, they never stood a chance. Or even, they've turned out surprisingly okay, in spite of the start that they had. And you know, I say all of that because I think it's definitely a principle that we could apply to what we've just read, to what the kids were doing in their sessions, to what Steph unpacked a bit of earlier. When you think about it, the Bible has more than its fair share of dysfunctional families. You know, there's Elkanah in the book of Samuel trying to keep his two wives happy. There's David and the whole sad and sorry mess in his family. So much of it seems to flow out of mistakes that he makes. And the Bible talks, doesn't it, about the sins of parents sometimes being visited on the third and fourth generation. You find that in a couple of places in the Old Testament. And when we read those verses, I don't think it's speaking of some kind of curse. I don't think it's speaking of some kind of, rule of the universe. This is always how it's going to be. But it's inevitable that we end up making the same mistakes and conforming to the same patterns in our lives as previous generations. I just wonder if it speaks to a general principle in life. That there are patterns and there are issues in families, and stuff tends to get repeated. Stuff tends to get played out like that. And I certainly think we see that in the family of Joseph. So here is a family which wouldn't be out of place in the German culture. Switch it on one afternoon and they'll be there. If you contacted Central Casting and said, give me a dysfunctional family, Joseph and his brothers may well turn up. And it's interesting, I actually read these chapters of Genesis probably about 2 months ago in my morning quiet times. And I didn't know that Clara was going to send me an email from New Abington then with this text on it saying, you can preach on this. But I remember reading this story and just thinking, oh, this is awful. This is dreadful, particularly some of the ways that Joseph behaves. And the actual text, which was allocated this morning, was Genesis 42 to 45. There's just way too big to look at in one service. But one of the things that strikes me, and we'll give us a little summary of it now, is just how manipulative Joseph is. And just how much of a game that he plays with his brothers. It's almost as if he revels in the power that he has over them. And if you know the story, he even goes so far as to frame them of theft. So I'm just saying this up front. I struggle with aspects of this story and how unappealing Joseph can be. But then I come back to what I said earlier. And you look at the family history, and you look at what has gone before, and you think, is it really a surprise that things have turned out like they have? So you look at Joseph's mum and dad, and you can't deny that they've probably played a role in him being as he is. If you were doing family therapy, then where would you begin with Jacob, Joseph's dad? This is the man who is possibly most famous, or infamous, for the terrible deception which he carries out against his own twin brother. Remember that awful plan cooked up to deceive Isaac, who is old and blind, and Jacob talks him into giving him the blessing that should have been due to Esau. And of course, if we know the details of the story, we'll also be aware that it's not a plan that he comes up with of his own accord, because his mum cooks up the whole plot. It's Rebecca who instigates it all. It's terrible, it's heartbreaking. I mean, what sort of mum cooks up this sort of scheme? Do you know what I mean? To divide the two boys against each other. And of course, it causes Jacob to spend years on the run. He meets up with Esau. He turns out to be far more gracious than we might have expected. And yet it seems Jacob doesn't seem to learn. There's an old line that one of the biggest lessons of history is we never learn the lessons of history. And it seems to be played out in this family. It seems to apply to Jacob. You would think that Jacob might have thought, after everything that went on with him and Esau, maybe it's not a good idea to show favoritism to your children. But he doesn't seem to get that message, and instead we're given this detail about the family back in chapter 37. Find some next slide. That Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that the father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and could not speak a kind word to him. And of course, this is how it begins. This latest kind of cycle of family drama. Remember the coat of many colours? And it's not helped by the way Joseph behaves. I mean, instead of making an effort and playing nice to his brothers, and maybe trying to win them round, Joseph tells them, you know how the story goes on, well, I've had this dream, and turns out one day I'm going to rule over all of you. You know, of course, you can't blame them for having the dream, but maybe you think, was it wise to tell them? You know, sometimes you can overshare. I think it's fair to say. And of course, many of us might be familiar with what happens next. You've got that terrible episode where the brothers attack Joseph, they sell him to the Ishmaelites, and then they go home and tell Jacob, oh, terrible things happened. Joseph's been attacked and killed. And it's very sad. But you can't get away from the fact that maybe what goes around has come around. So the man who deceived his dad and his brother is now being deceived by his own children. Cycles and cycles. And yet Joseph is not done, because this is another Christian aspect of the story. We might not like him. We might even balk at the dream he has, but Joseph, we can't deny God has his hand on him. So Joseph is a survivor. Joseph is one of these people who just seems to have this, well, he's got this God-given capacity for having dreams, for interpreting dreams, and he's protected even when other people are trying to take him down, when his brothers try and kill him, when Potiphar's wife unjustly accuses him. And so you know how the story goes. Pharaoh has dreams, Joseph interprets them. There's this famine, but the people of Egypt are able to find their way through this because the plans that they make on the basis of Joseph's interpretation. So remember, they make use of the 7 years of plenty, they stockpile, they've got enough to see them through when the famine comes. And again, the story goes on, and the same pattern is played out. What goes around comes around. So the famine which impacts Jacob also impacts, or which impacts Egypt, also impacts Jacob and his remaining sons. So Jacob sends them from Canaan to Egypt to see if they can get some food. So Joseph, of course, is now in this position of power, even though they don't recognize him. And of course, he decides to string them along for a little bit longer. And this is where the story gets complicated. So this is where Joseph, in effect, sets a couple of traps for the brothers. So he sells them grain but then he puts the money back in their sacks. And he also keeps Simeon in prison as a bargaining chip, and then demands that Benjamin be brought back to Egypt to meet him. And all the time this is happening, you get the sense that the brothers are clearly spooked. You know, if you're familiar with the story, they know that a game is being played. They know that they are at the mercy of a higher power, but they can't quite prove why. So if we're going to put it very bluntly, I mean, Joseph effectively messes with their heads. He does, doesn't he? Because he's stringing them along. And so they go back with Benjamin, and they acknowledge the issue of the silver in their bag, and how things are working out. But there's another deception on the part of Joseph, because again he plants silver in their sacks of grain, and he puts his own silver cup in Benjamin's sack. And when this is discovered, it leads brothers to kind of throw themselves at the mercy of Joseph. So this is what we get to by the end of chapter 44. They are begging to have some mercy, and they explain that their father is old and back at home in Canaan. He's lost one son. It's going to break his heart to lose another. I read the story a couple of weeks ago again to get ready for the sermon, and I think the thing that came across is just a sort of tragedy. Because as you read it, I'm just struck by how everyone, to some extent or another, just seems in this story to be trapped. I think the brothers are trapped, and they're trapped by their guilt. I think they are locked together, aren't they, in this horrible kind of pact, because they know what they did to Joseph. They share this responsibility for that awful thing that they've done to him. They share this terrible responsibility for what they've done to their dad in deceiving him. And all the while, you can see that this guilt is playing on the mind. So they maybe think they're being punished, and they're also thinking, my goodness, how do we prevent even more loss to our dad? So they're trapped. Jacob is trapped by grief, it seems. He seems just to be bereft. There are people we know sometimes who can never move on from a loss. Jacob is trapped. And Joseph, I think, for all his part, comes across as being trapped as well. To some extent, it's as if he is trapped just by his resentment towards brothers and what they've done. And so he can't help himself with playing this game. And it's really sad. And if I'm honest, I find it hard to feel much besides sympathy for them. Because if we're honest, let's face it, this is how it often goes for us as well. We often find ourselves trapped, yeah? Every single one of us here might be listening to this story and thinking about stuff which has happened to us, and frustrations or disappointments that we're carrying, or relationships that seem broken and beyond repair, and we just think, wish we could put it right. I wish we could go back and do things differently, but we can't. You know, it is what it is, and we are where we are. Here's another thing. Even though I read this story and I read it with a kind of sadness, I also read it with a hopefulness. Because I just want to ask you to think about one other thing. In spite of the fact that all of these people are trapped, it seems to me that there's something here about how they're not completely consumed by their anger or their guilt or their grief or their disappointments. So again, if you have time, go back and look again at the story. And I think what you see there is that the brothers are full of guilt, but actually they also come across as being determined that no more damage will be done. There's a little bit of grace. They are determined no more loss. Whatever we do, we can't allow our dad, we can't allow Jacob to go through anymore. And I think Jacob is full of grief, but there's still signs of grace for him. There is still some hope in God. There's a really telling little moment. Chapter 43, verse 14. He's sending the brothers back to Joseph, and he says this, "May God Almighty grant me mercy before the man." And it's just one brief moment, but it counts for a lot. See, God isn't mentioned very much in this story, but he is mentioned here, and I think this is a prayer that gets answered. So Jacob, in spite of everything, in spite of his grief, he still is able to bring the name of God into the story and say a prayer. and say, may God have mercy. And then there's Joseph himself, and yes, he is manipulative. And yes, he seems to enjoy being the puppet master, everyone on my strings, pulling them along. But he does still seem to feel a little bit of compassion. What's interesting, he feels compassion for Benjamin. Maybe because he's his little brother. Maybe because he's the youngest one in his family. He thinks Benjamin might be a way of preserving something good. Maybe he thinks Benjamin is my last one to my mum, to Rachel. But for whatever, there's a bit of compassion there. And what do you know? God is able to turn around this situation. And God is able to take these broken people and work through them and their mess. I just wonder if God is able to work through them because there are little impulses of grace and compassion. And God looks at that, and once God has these little impulses of grace, God's got a foothold, and God's going to work and start doing something in these people's lives. And it's Joseph who acknowledges that in the reading we had earlier. And it's also dramatic, incredibly dramatic. Emmanuel read it to us because we've got like the grand reveal of verse 3. 3 words are uttered, and the whole story changes. I am Joseph. Yeah. All changes. And all turns around. And Joseph goes on to talk about how everything that has happened has been the work of God. And I just draw your attention to it. I think it's the next slide, Simon. Verse 5. Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for sending me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. I mean, what a moment of grace. He stands there and he's able to say, don't be angry with yourselves. Verse 7. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by great deliverance. And there's a tiny little word used here for the first time in all of Scripture, and it will come up again. Remnant. Literally means like a body of survivors. It carries the sense, actually, of something quite sad and quite sorry. And sometimes that describes us. You have just a remnant. But while you've got a remnant, you've still got life and hope. You've still got the beginning of even something very small that can move forward. And then he says it again in verse 6. So that it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father of Pharaoh, Lord of this entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. All of this, Joseph is saying, has been God's doing. And what are we to make of this? Like I said earlier, I think it's a really sad story. There is so much waste. What a waste, you think, all the years when people spend time not really being honest with each other, not really being honest with themselves. What a lot of pain. But God is still at work. God is still using this mess of family, these people who are so damaged and who cause damage to each other, and he uses them, and he is moving forward his purposes. He's told Abraham, he's made a promise to Abraham, I'm going to use your family, Abraham, to bless all the nations of the earth. And still uses them. Still, when you think, my goodness, their actions are doing everything to make it impossible, still he uses them. Still he uses them to bless us. From our family line, from this family line comes Jesus. And still he can use us. I think that's what comes across. Still he can use you. It was really fascinating what Steph said earlier about going through your family pictures. During lockdown, I did the same thing myself. Maybe I went through all the old pictures that we had of sort of pre-digital cameras and pre-phones. And went through years of them. Old photos from mum and dad as well. You know, the old photos I've got. And it's hard. It's bittersweet, isn't it? It really is. But you know, there are times when you look and you think, yeah, I do feel trapped. I do feel I've made mistakes, but I just want you to hear folks, you run into Baptist church, and you and your families, whatever is going on, whatever flaws you have, whatever pain you've had, whatever it is you feel you're carrying from a previous generation, whatever you feel has been handed down to you that you can't control, God can change it. God can make it better. God can take you and God can take the people around you and work out of your lives so much good. It's just a final thought I want to leave with you. For me, one of the most moving lines in this whole story is the one that comes at the very end of this chapter. And it's the line which speaks to me most about the redemption and the newness God can bring. And the change God can bring about, even in situations which would seem impossible. And we read this. It's just the word of redemption. Next slide, Simon. Israel said, I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive. And I will go and see him before I die. Now, isn't that amazing? Isn't that a testimony to what God can do? And what I find beautiful, and what I find fascinating and very hope-giving, is that this is not just a statement to celebrate in and of itself. It points the way forward to some words that we find on the lips of another father in a story told by Jesus. Because the prodigal son comes home and the father says, we need to have a party. Because my son was dead and now he's alive. When you think someone is dead, and then you discover you're alive, it changes everything. It is absolutely wonderful. It is a transformation, and I think you could say it's a sort of resurrection. And it speaks to me of what God can do in my life, and in your life, and in the life of New Rising Baptist Church. Every one of us here is going to have a situation that we're in, or we're walking through, or we're aware of, and we think it's hopeless. We think it's bleak, and we don't see any way that it can be turned around. And God says, I think, to us in this word this morning, look at what happened to Joseph's family. Look at what happened to the father of that prodigal son who thought, the boy's gone off, and I will never ever see him again. God says, most of all, look at what happened and what you celebrated just a couple of weeks ago now. An empty tomb that was sealed up a few days ago, and power and life and newness has rocketed out of it, and the world is changed. Wherever you find yourself, whatever's going on, He can change it. He can transform it. He can make it new. I pray. Oh dear God, we thank you for your love and your mercy. Thank you that in families that are broken, in situations that are broken, and perhaps circumstances where there only seem to be dead ends, you can make ways that are new. You can open up new possibilities. You can bring about reconciliation and forgiveness. You can bring about healing. You can bring about restoration. You can bring people back into our lives and restore relationships where we thought things were bleak and the possibility of change had all but gone. I think about these people in their brokenness, and I think about how there were still little waves of grace, little bits of compassion, little moments when they hoped, little bits of determination that things wouldn't get any worse. And I pray you help us to have those bits of determination ourselves, ways of working towards forgiveness, and ways of insisting that things can be better, that make it possible for new things to happen. So we trust you for the things we've been thinking about as these stories have been told, and we commit these things to you. In your name, Jesus. Amen. So friends, I invite you to stand if you're able.